Welcome to Hard Talk from Chisinau, capital of Moldova, Europe's poorest country. And right now, the stage for another political and strategic tug of war between the European Union and Russia. My guest today is Moldova's Prime Minister, Iurie Leanca. His ambition is to see this country become a full member of the European Union. But there is a problem. A chunk of Moldovan territory has been in the control of pro-Russian separatists since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, maybe that sounds a little bit familiar. So how does Moldova avoid the fate of neighboring Ukraine? Prime Minister Iurie Leanca, welcome to Hard Talk. Has the crisis and the violence in Ukraine brought a real sense of vulnerability, insecurity here in Moldova?
Well, the tragic developments in Ukraine, which is just in our neighborhood, of course, are very dangerous for Ukraine, but they are very dangerous for the region and for the continent. Not just because by these violent actions we see the entire very still fragile security architecture which was in the process of being built is now basically destroyed, and we need to launch the process again. But because it does raise a lot of concerns in terms of security, concerns in terms of our economic situation, because we, especially in Moldova, are a very small country and very dependent and vulnerable on the regional shocks and on the regional problems.
So you feel vulnerable today? You sound as though you feel vulnerable.
What is even worse, it brings, and it has brought and it still brings, the uncertainty. And there is nothing worse than uncertainty, because you don't know what might happen today, what might happen tomorrow, and what shall be your answers to those possible scenarios, both positive or also eventually negative.
You talk of uncertainty. Surely what has become more clear, more certain, is that Russia has the ability and certainly the intention to impose its influence and ultimately, you could argue, its authority on its neighborhood, what they call the near abroad, the old Soviet empire, if you like, and you stand as a part of that near abroad.
Well, we are not direct neighbors with Russia, but Russia to us is an important country for many, many reasons.
You're a former part of the Soviet Union.
Yes, we used to be part of the empire.
And we know that Putin says the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union, and he wants to reassert Russian and Moscow's authority over what used to be the Soviet empire.
What we have to understand that there are new realities, and the realities of the new world is that Moldova, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Russia are subjects of the international law and equal subjects, and that if we want to have a predictable and civilized relationship in this part of the world, and based on it to build a stable, predictable and also a prosperous region, we need to respect each other's opinions. We need to recognize, and by the way, we always acknowledge, and we do acknowledge, Russia's legitimate interests. The only problem is how you pursue those interests.
Does Russia have legitimate interests in Moldova?
Well, Russia has legitimate interests, EU has legitimate interests, US have Chinese as well, big countries. The only problem is how you pursue those interests. You can project your soft power, your attractiveness, and that's what basically EU does, that's what EU does, and that's what Russia should do in order to get this influence and to have a role in the developments.
I dare say you have thought about this very carefully, because you, more than any other Moldovan politician, have driven through this closer relationship with the European Union. In a sense, the association agreement that you've just signed and your parliament has just ratified is your baby. And you know better than anyone that Moscow regards it as highly provocative.
Well, this stance of Moscow on the association agreement, and especially on the part which is related to the trade arrangements, is a bit new, because we came to power in 2009 in September. And from the very first day since we came to power, we pursued exactly the same rhetoric, the same objectives, whether we were in Moscow or in Chisinau or in Brussels. So it was not a secret to anyone, and that's why this reaction is a bit strange to us. That's number one. Number two, we respect the opinion of our immediate neighbors, and we have two neighbors, of our other partners, and Russia, as I mentioned, is among the important partners. But what is most important for me as a politician, for Moldovan society, is to choose our path. And from my understanding, my analysis, and our judgment here is that there is no alternative to us if we want to build a normal European and to some extent hopefully boring society. And for this we need to bring in here values which prove to be extremely efficient in the new members of the European Union, Baltic countries, Romania, Hungary or Poland. We need to apply the same standards, we need to apply the same rules. And then I'm sure Moldova will become a functioning state. There are no alternatives.
Well, that is your hope, and I sense the passion with which you deliver those words. But you must have heard the Deputy Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Rogozin say just the other day, this association with the European Union means Moldova is fundamentally changing its neutral status. And as far as Russia is concerned, that is not acceptable.
Well, Dmitry Rogozin used to say many things, and one problem which I have is that usually he communicates with us via Twitter and Facebook account, and I would prefer, and I always prefer, to have a direct communication, a dialogue, and exchange of views and arguments. As you know it very well, there are members of the European Union which are neutral countries or countries outside the military blocs: Austria, Sweden, Finland. So by becoming a member of the European Union, and we still have a long way until we become full-fledged members of the European Union, it doesn't mean that we need to change our status as a neutral country. Again, it has nothing to do with it. It is just simply a wrong and distorted approach on what neutrality means and what membership, future membership.
Why do you think the Russians are playing this game then, if you think it is a game?
Well, it's difficult to understand. In our dialogue with officials in Moscow, foreign ministry in first place, because they are to represent the country's official position, they know it very well. The accession to the EU has nothing to do with the changing of neutrality. As to the neutrality, I do believe for my country it is still an asset. We just need to prove, and here Russian colleagues should and could help us to prove that it's not a liability, but it's a real asset which could bring more stability and more predictability, more security to our country. That's on what I would like Mr. Rogozin to focus, because if he's a big fan of our neutrality, he should help us to get rid of the former 14th Russian army from the Transnistrian region.
Well, I'm glad you introduced the subject of Transnistria, because it fascinates me that we talk about Russia, and we should, for our audience, explain that you were trained in Moscow during the time of the Soviet Union as a diplomat. You even served for a short time as a Soviet diplomat before the collapse of the Soviet Union. You know Moscow's mindset very well, and you know how much Moscow still sees the situation in Transnistria, where there is a small population which has broken away from your state, even though it's on your territory, and which looks to Moscow for its future. You know that that gives Moscow enormous leverage inside your country.
Well, it is true. I was trained as a future Soviet diplomat back in the 80s, and I'm very proud and very grateful to those who taught me in Moscow.
And may I interrupt and say, you know, therefore, that the fact there are nearly 2,000 Russian troops permanently stationed on your soil inside Transnistria is something which gives Russia a huge stake in the future of Transnistria and Moldova.
Well, it's not just through this military presence that Russia has an important leverage over the developments, and that's why Russia was, is, and will be a very important partner in our joint efforts together with the Ukrainians, together with the EU and US and the OSCE, to find a solution, a political solution. No one, again, neglects or ignores or underestimates Russia's influence, but also role in the region. My only request was always to my Russian colleagues and friends that, again, by acknowledging their interest, let's change a bit the way they pursue it. I know that after 23 years since the former Soviet Union was broken, it's still a painful process until we learn that there are new realities. And I understand that sometimes it's not a rational approach, but mostly emotions, which unfortunately are the basis for certain decisions.
You must realize that if your relations with Moscow continue to deteriorate, there is a very real possibility that Russian military intervention could happen in Transnistria just as it did in Crimea, and you would be powerless to stop it. You know that.
In the Transnistrian region, which is beyond our control, you are right, nothing happened to the extent that the situation would become outside of anyone's control. I appreciated that they didn't take unilateral decisions. I appreciate and I know that our colleagues from Moscow did exercise a kind of stabilizing effect on those in Transnistria. And that's what I can hope also for the future.
But it's very fragile. It is very fragile.
Well, it is fragile, but again, there is a mechanism. There is this 5+2 talks. And again, I hope that no one is interested in a new source of tension.
Well, I'll tell you what.
We have enough it already in Ukraine.
Mr. Rogozin, whom we've already mentioned, the Deputy Prime Minister in Russia, who's responsible for Transnistria in Russia, he made a point of going to their Transnistrian Victory Day celebrations just a couple of months back in May. And while he was there, he said to the Transnistrians, "We will do everything necessary to act as the guarantors of your security." It was quite clearly a threat to you.
Well, I'm not saying that we ignore or neglect what Mr. Rogozin says, and unfortunately sometimes his statements are even offensive, not to say that they are not very constructive. But we are trying to do our best, in first place, not to give any reasons to our Russian colleagues somehow to take a line which might lead to a worsening of the relationship. That's not our interest. We want to keep a very active political dialogue. We want our trade to develop, and we do believe that the European integration makes us more predictable, makes us more stable and more reliable interlocutor, which serves not just the interests of our society and our relation with the West, but also our relations with the East.
I can see that that might work as long as you are in power, because you are determined to push forward with this policy. But there are elections coming in Moldova in November, and the main opposition party and its allies, the communists, they are absolutely opposed to your association agreement, and they want actually to join the Russian-backed customs union and be much closer to Moscow. Now, your predecessor as Prime Minister, Vladimir Filat, he said just the other day, Russia has increased its intelligence activity inside Moldova, in political parties, in NGOs, in the media, and they have only one objective: to destabilize the government in the run-up to November's elections. Do you agree with him?
So far, I have no big evidence of this direct activities, subversive nature of it. Yes, we have NGOs which are sponsored from Moscow, and it's not against our legislation. But our key problem, again, we can always say that Moscow is meddling, Moscow is irresponsible, Moscow's hand, so to say, is in charge. And just to look for forgiveness for our kind of impotence. But that's not exactly what I think we should do. There are things which depend on us, and there are things which do not depend on us. So what happens in the region, unfortunately, is beyond our control. But there are things and issues and weaknesses in our society which are our direct responsibility. For example, we need to have much more sustainable institutions. Isn't it our task? Can Moscow somehow impede us? No. It is our responsibility, and we need to make our institutions much stronger. Corruption. Is it Moscow responsible that we still have a thriving corruption in this country? No, it's our responsibility, it's our guilt also, and we need to do much more.
Right. Let us now think more about your aspirations. You, I think, coined this phrase for your strategy. You called it Rethink Moldova, and you wanted to tell Moldova that if you are to become a part of the European family, there has to be fundamental institutional and structural reform. Right. The problem seems to me to be this, that you are not in any position to fix the endemic, the systematic corruption inside your country.
Not true. Yes, we were quite slow in tackling this key issue, corruption. Key because it's not just endangering the activities of the state institutions. but it creates this constant irritation for our normal day-to-day life of our citizens. And in this way, they don't trust, they don't have confidence in the future of this country, and they just migrate. And in this way, we don't have confidence and support from our European and American friends, those who believe in the independent justice, but the justice which should act according to the law. In the last 1 month, to give you just one example, we put behind the bars, first time in our history, 2 judges, which is extremely difficult because we see the huge resistance from their corporation, but which shows the seriousness of our approach, which also shows that our colleagues in the justice now finally understand we cannot live anymore like this. Society has reached this critical point, and we need to change it. So what I'm saying is, it is not easy.
Excuse me, but you've put a couple of judges behind bars, a few police officers as well, whom the people you have not taken on and put behind bars are the people who really matter. That is the politicians and their friends at the very top of Moldovan society who are driving the corruption. And I say you're not in no position to fix this problem, and I say it because you came to power because your predecessor was locked in a bitter set of allegations and counter-allegations with Moldova's richest businessman, Vladimir Plahotniuc. Now, Mr. Filat, the former Prime Minister, Mr. Plahotniuc still hold key positions. Mr. Filat is still the leader of your political party. Mr. Plahotniuc is still the leader of the Democrats, a key coalition member of your government. His party still in effect appoints key positions like the Prosecutor General, the prosecutor in the anti-corruption department. These people who are under a cloud of suspicion are still at the very top of your government.
Again, if you look at what has happened in the last few months, it's the expression of understanding that everyone on the top of this elite, political elite, but those also the grassroots understand that we cannot bear anymore.
Why is Mr. Plahotniuc still a key member of your governing coalition? Why was his party given the authority to appoint the Prosecutor General?
Well, he is a high-ranking member of the Democratic Party, which is an important partner in the coalition.
All of the allegations.
No one has proved, and we know that there is such a principle in a democratic society as you need to prove that someone is guilty. Until it's not proven, he is not guilty. So that's why
you're the man who has vowed to completely change the mentality of your country. Now you sound like a man who is part of the old regime.
No, that's what I'm saying. That's why it's so important for us to build an independent justice system, independent courts, who would not look at who is in whether he's a high-level politician, a prime minister, a minister, or I don't know, a fellow judge. And that's why the European integration is so important for us, because the European Commission is offering us money, expertise, but also puts pressure on us. And only in conjunction with our political will, plus this transfer of expertise, we can work. I am not a lawyer myself, but I understand if you don't start with the justice system, you will never be able really to fight corruption and to put high-ranking officials also behind the bars. If the judge could be bought, and then how do you want to take in to the justice those who are punishable? That's why, again, the reform of the justice is key for us. That's why we received from the European Commission, if I'm not mistaken, 60 million euros grant to help us. That's why I hope very much we've started discussions to bring even judges from countries like Sweden or Finland, to put them next to our judges and to make sure that our judges' activities are monitored.
You've got a lot of work to do. Before we end, I just want you to address with me, if you would, the perception that Europe and the European Union has of Moldova today. You want ultimately to be a full member of the EU.
Yes.
You say it can be achieved within 5 years. I just wonder whether you are aware of the degree to which Europe, the EU, looks at Moldova and still sees a place where not just corruption is still endemic, but also organized crime is a massive problem.
Not because
and
I
the people
think
trafficking,
the people trafficking. If you look back in 2009 and what happens today, the trend is very, very positive, and that's what America Americans, but also people in Brussels can confirm that yes, we still have the problem, but the situation is much better in terms of not just prevention, but in terms of punishing those who were engaged. Because before 2009, almost no one was put behind the bars for trafficking. The same is on the organized crime. This city is pretty secure. Yes, we still have problems, but we are reforming the police in a critical and crucial way. So we see already the results in terms of the relationship between the police and the citizen.
But I just wonder whether you feel that you've missed a window of opportunity in Europe, because if you see the last European election results, you see that an extraordinary performance by nationalistic, some would say sometimes xenophobic political parties in Western Europe who are anti-immigrant, they are worried about open borders, and frankly they're very worried about extending the EU to countries like Moldova. And it may be that the political temperature in much of the European Union has moved against Moldova.
Moldovans have proved to be among the best people in terms of integrating themselves into the society. In Italy we have almost 200,000 Moldovans. In Portugal we have about 50,000. When I told Prime Minister of Portugal we need to bring them home, no, let's keep them there because they are very good and decent and hard-working people. But that's not really the problem, because we didn't really need them back home. Yes, we came with a delay, but I still believe that the window of opportunity is there. And what makes me happy is that despite these new feelings in Europe, everyone understands that even bringing the small Moldova would be an objective much bigger than the territory and the population of Moldova, because it would mean that we are able to spread the area of stability and security further to southeastern Europe, and not just to allow this instability to be driven into the EU.
If I may say so, Mr. Prime Minister, you strike me as an eternal optimist. Is not the likely outcome for Moldova that you will be stuck in a sort of twilight zone? You will be the subject of a perpetual tug of war between Moscow and the European Union, and then the net result will be that you will not be able to achieve the aspirations that you've set out with me.
1 year ago, several EU capitals never believed that Moldova will be able to get this visa-free regime. And it exists, and already 60,000 Moldovans were able to benefit from it, again, not to abuse, and it works. So I'm quite optimistic that yes, we will be able to get the European perspective to become candidate, and then to become, I don't know, it's not that important, but it's 5 or 7 or 8 years. What is critical for me is to win the elections, to continue this path, and to become candidate. Then we will be put on the irreversibility side of our pro-democratic, pro-reform movement.
And in a word, you will not let Vladimir Putin stop you.
We need just to convince our citizens that our path is the only one without alternative for Moldova. And I'm sure that we can do it. I believe in the wisdom, collective wisdom, but also individual wisdom of my fellow citizens. And together with the support from European friends and partners, we will get there, I'm sure.
Prime Minister Iurie Leanca, thank you very much for being on HARDtalk.
Thank you very much for your interest. I hope you come again to visit us.
Well, if you think you're going to be